Sarah,
Melissa,
what are we doing today?
we're hosting our first guest, Tom Halford.
Tom, what are we reading?
We're reading I Am a Truck by Michelle Winters.
It is very exciting to have our first guest on the podcast today.
It is, and it's very cool to have Tom for a lot of reasons, but partly because he's been there right since the beginning for you and I, hasn't he, Sarah?
Certainly has.
I mean, technically, Sarah and Melissa were a unit before Tom and Melissa were a unit. Sarah, do you want to talk about how we all met one another and maybe some of your first impressions of Tom?
We all first met in late summer of 2007, right before we started our master's program at Memorial University. The way we all met was kind of interesting because this was kind of at the dawn of Facebook, the Facebook era, when it was still cool and not like for a bunch of middle-aged and retirees. So Melissa actually had started a Facebook group for all of the students that were going to be in our cohort for the master's program. So we all got like this little sneak preview of each other's lives via, Facebook creeping. And so for Tom, first of all, like first impressions, Tom wasn't Tom Halford as we know him now. He was actually Tino Halfredi, if I remember correctly. Or was it
Thomasino?
It was
you and I
Thomasino.
shortened it to Tino.
It was a fake name because I was teaching public school.
Exactly. That first impression of like, okay, this is an interesting name that he's given himself. And so I know I personally thought like, I feel like he's going to be an interesting character. I think he's going to be kind of a funny guy. And he was when we all met in person. Tom definitely was someone that added some like levity to our group, I feel like. And, he would regale us with stories of back in New Brunswick and St. John with all of his friends and brothers recording videos. We would watch his like home movies that he would make. And once we got into the classroom, though, what was so interesting for me is I saw how serious he was about our studies. He was the one that would be like the first one to have a book read, the first one to start working on any kind of like a written project that we needed to complete. I would be burning the midnight oil, like, last second getting a paper written. And he would already be on like his fourth draft because he was working on it for weeks. And I had so much respect for that. Where he's gone from there, I could see the seeds of that in those early days of our master's program. So those were my first impressions.
Thank you. I'm glad they're good ones.
I was all positive. Yeah, immediate affection for sure.
Yeah, he definitely put us all to shame. Well, no, I'll speak for myself. He put me to shame. I remember being like, "Oh, wow, you're working really hard at all of this."
Yeah,
and
definitely.
being like, I should try that more. But I also know that at the end of that grad program, I was very much ready to be done with school. And Tom chose to continue. I mean, I think for you, Tom, reading is a pretty big part of your life, really, and your whole like personality. I think you made a pretty big commitment to reading, in fact, which eventually resulted in you getting a PhD in English literature. So maybe we can kind of use that as a segue to delve into our conversation today. As someone who has a PhD in English literature, can you maybe start by explaining why that makes you better than the rest of us?
Well, it puts me into a percentage of people who are statistically better. No, I don't think it makes me. I think it actually makes me worse than people. Don't you think? Like,
how so?
More navel gazing, more sort of locked up in my ivory tower of false compassion. And no, I think, you know what it is? I think as much as anything, it's just, I just really like what I'm doing. Like, I just always enjoyed it so much, and it never really felt like work. Even drafting stuff, I just enjoy it. And I think it's just probably more so something weird and something sort of antisocial and work obsessed than anything anything positive.
I don't know, though. I feel like, it's so hard to figure out what you want to do with your life. I think for you, you really found early on where your interests were and you went for it. And the fact that you enjoy what you do, I think is such a gift.
One thing I thought might be interesting to talk about with you too, Tom, is like so often reading is sort of like the niche of women in some ways. And we were looking at some of the analytics of the podcast, and we have, very, very few male listeners. But in your case, if you look at even our grad class, there was more males than females. If you
True.
look at a lot of like English literature departments at various university campuses, more males than females. What do you think is going on there? Like, do you think there's a gendered discussion to be had, or is it just coincidence?
I mean, yeah, there has to be something. I think if you go into Kohl's or Barnes and Noble, and you look at the marketing towards what books are being marketed, it does look like there is more marketing towards female readers. And even just thinking about books in terms of like books for male readers, they do seem very like bro-hemmy, like very like very masculine books. So there has to be something related to marketing. I think there's also something culturally I only know New Brunswick and Newfoundland. There does seem to be something in terms of young boys and males not necessarily thinking of reading as something that they should be doing or something that they could just enjoy doing. They might not have the right types of books that are accessible to them. This is going to sound like a silly title for a book, but it's one of the more important studies in education for New Brunswick, at least. The title of the book is "Reading Don't Fix Chevys." Right. So this whole idea of, the lack of utility to reading, like, why would I read a book? That's useless. And if I'm going to read a book, it's not going to be fiction. It has to be something that really happened. And even better, I want like a manual or a handbook, and that's what I'll really read because I'll be able to use it. And I think that, it has to go back in some ways to a failure to think about just imagining things being so useful and being so enriching for our lives. Guys don't always. They can't see that, I think, quite as clearly. So it's probably marketing. It's probably also just cultural. Those two things are pretty powerful, I think.
I think so. Yeah, the way that kind of like things are gendered, right? As we're raising our children, the types of toys or the types of books or the types of anything, art, culture that we're exposing our boys versus our girls to may be different. And I think it's so embedded that we don't necessarily realize it until further along. And then suddenly you have boys who are really great at math and science and quote unquote practical skills, and girls who are interested in, literature and art and history. But it makes me think about how I'm like educating my own son, or I have a strong relationship with books. And so, reading is a big part of our relationship. Like I read to him multiple books every single night, and I'm really hoping that he can stick with that, and that he can look to a book throughout his life as a source of not just entertainment, but education and enlightenment.
We've been talking about this just like in our circle of friends lately too, about how like you really can't force your kids to read. And even when they are exposed to readers in their life, it doesn't automatically mean that they'll just love reading. And we've been super fortunate, like both of our kids do enjoy reading. Like they are, we're super grateful for that because we know it doesn't come easily for everybody. Conversations we've had with other parents who are just like, they just don't like it. Like there's no joy in it. And then if there's no joy in it, it's like, so there's no starting point, right? Like, where do you go from there? So yeah. And like you said, that sort of blend of like covert operation to educate them. Like our kids read like, Diary of a Wimpy Kid, like, they're not like, highbrow reading, but it's like, it doesn't matter, right? Like they'll bust into laughter just like partway through whatever they're reading. And it's like, you couldn't ask for anything more. And then every once in a while, one of them will be like, oh yeah, that reminds me of this time in such and such a book when this happened, like that they draw these connections between their interactions with people and then what they've seen play out in books. It's pretty magical, really.
Well, let's talk about the book that Tom has read and is going to enlighten us with today. So the book that you selected has a very interesting name. I Am a Truck. So can we make some guesses about what this book is about?
For sure.
Is this book about climate change? Is it meant to encourage us to develop stronger relationships with our vehicles, especially trucks, as we continue to destroy the planet through fossil fuels?
Oh, no.
Oh, okay. Well, is it a book about an objectophile who actually like physically and sexually is attracted to their truck?
You know what? That's not too far off.
Oh,
There's nothing sexual about it, but
oh,
it's more
that's a
so.
bummer.
It would more so be just how we're all attached to our vehicle, rather than like something perverted.
Like our vehicles are an extension of us.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
Okay.
interesting.
All right.
Okay, I definitely was expecting a hard no on
Yeah.
that. Since there wasn't, maybe you could just go ahead and tell us what the book is about.
Okay. I Am a Truck features Agathe and Réjean Lapointe. They are two main characters, and they've been married for a long period of time. They don't have any kids, and one day Réjean goes missing, and there is some kind of a build-up to him going missing. The way Winters builds the novel, she has a then and now, so we go back and forth in time, and I think it's done really well. There is some mystery to his disappearance, and it gets resolved in a satisfying way. But as much as anything, it's more about sort of Agathe trying to live her life without Réjean and trying to find some kind of I don't know, ability to exist on her own, because they've been so interconnected and so dependent on one another. The novel overall is sort of like a literary crime thriller, but I would say that it could work without the missing persons case too.
Mm.
And the truck aspect is, for me, is really interesting thematically, and the excerpt that I'll read is going to highlight some of that. But it's essentially about the ways in which, you know, objects in our lives, we think of them as these passive things, but objects are so active, and they inform our behavior and our identity to a pretty strong extent, right? And I think you can see it really clearly when you think about the men's relationships to their vehicles. You know, and in this book, it's the difference between a Chevy and a Ford, and how that is such a big part of certain people's personas.
Hmm.
Yeah, and so Réjean he's a Chevy, he's a proud driver of Chevys, and it's interesting because he's notable because he is such a physically large and imposing man, and he also chooses a vehicle that reflects that physically large, imposing aspect of him. In a way, he also has this sort of gentle aspect to his personality that works against that physical size. But he has this sort of undercurrent of rage that he's always wanting to experiment with, and it's a really interesting aspect to his character and how it connects to him going missing ultimately.
Okay. Oh, this sounds very interesting. And how did you come to read this book? Like, have you read anything by Winters previously, or?
I have to give you the honest, boring answer. I found it for research. So I research Atlantic Canadian literature, and I'm really interested in objects as well. So I found it by researching for it.
Sorry. So where is the book based from? Like, is it in Atlantic Canada? Oh, it's in New Brunswick. Totally makes sense.
French New Brunswick. So they're Acadian. The two characters, they're Acadian. Yep. Sorry, I said French New Brunswick, but really they're around English speakers. So they're Acadian, but they're around English speakers, and it's in New Brunswick.
And part of, as I understand it, part of the book is written in French without any translation. Is that correct?
Yeah. So I should speak French because I grew up in New Brunswick. My French is really weak. So Violet was listening. My daughter Violet was listening. Our daughter Violet was listening to it with me. And our daughter Violet was listening to I Am a Truck with us, and she was picking up on the Acadian French, and she was telling me what some of it meant.
Oh, that's cool.
Why did she choose to have like a mainly English book set in this French setting? Like, or is it just this is where the story was happening, this is where it made the most sense, or did she have some kind of goal there?
I think thematically it all works really well with the truck, with English culture sort of imposing itself onto them, because one of the other main themes alongside vehicles is there's so much discussion of classic rock in the text, and it's really fun. And believe it or not, this is not something I ever thought of as an English speaker growing up in New Brunswick. Mm-hmm. The Acadian characters, some of the Acadian characters, like Réjean, he really dislikes rock and roll because it's the English influence onto his culture. And so Agathe, she kind of wants to listen to rock and roll, and she doesn't really agree with him in that aspect. So it's a bit of tension in their relationship. I think that having them as French speakers, first of all, it's kind of a part of New Brunswick that doesn't always get narrated as much. in the rest of Canadian literature. Something that does happen as a New Brunswicker, you hear people speaking in French and you just don't know what they're saying. So it's also kind of an honest reflection of living in New Brunswick too.
Mm.
I think it's really clever how it works in the text.
Acadian French, and I think this also goes along with what you're talking about with the classic rock too, is that it's also heavily influenced by English. So I suspect that a lot of it, I mean, the joke phrase, and I grew up in a part of the Maritimes where there's a lot of Acadians and French speakers. The joke was always this phrase, je vais aller parquer mon car. Parking mon car, you're going to go park your car, because there's like enough French in there. There's enough English in there that sort of everybody's able to have a conversation together. But I think, like you said, with some of these gaps. So I'm assuming also that Winters did use that type of French as well.
I mean, it felt pretty accessible. I didn't feel like I didn't know what was going on, or I didn't feel alienated by it. So,
but would you agree that it was like a dialect?
Yeah. But there's also a French speaker from France who is a significant character in the text too.
Are they speaking English?
So he speaks French. It's really interesting. So there's another character named Martin, and Martin is descended from French speakers, but he only speaks English, and he secretly learns French. He and Réjean have a relationship that they build as the story goes on. Martin is a Chevy dealer, and Martin secretly owns a Ford, but he never wants Réjean to know that he owns a Ford, so he keeps this secret from him. And also, since Réjean is such a strong French speaker, Martin really likes him and he wants to learn French. But by the time he's actually learned enough French, he feels that it would be awkward for him to tell Réjean that he can actually speak French. So he keeps it secret from him as well. So he has these two big secrets. So Martin ultimately goes to the one French speaker from France, and he's the one who actually converses with Martin in French. So I think there's something to be said about like learn French or the type of French that you get out of a textbook is probably more so the type of French from France, and the French speaker is able to converse with Martin in that way.
This is really interesting to me, and it's actually making me really interested in the book. Like, it wasn't something I have to confess that I was like drawn to, but knowing how they're kind of playing with that relationship with language and the cultures of New Brunswick and stuff, it is pretty interesting. And I was going to kind of ask you about the fact that this book was shortlisted for the Giller Prize, which is a very illustrious, Canadian literary award. And a lot of the stuff I saw online was that people were surprised that this book was even in that category. The way that you're describing it, I can definitely see why people would understand it as an important book explaining Canadian culture. But do you have any kind of reaction to that?
Yes. And so for me, I think that I could definitely see this as kind of like a sleeper surprise hit, especially with the Giller, because not only does it talk about some relevant cultural issues in the country, but it's also just an incredibly weird and goofy, fun thriller. It's really funny in the sense of like, when you think about the different things that Winters chooses to do in the text, that's when it becomes really funny. Like when you're reading it, you're not like laughing out loud, but you're thinking, oh, it's so clever that she did this or that. And there's other aspects of it that I feel like I'm in a David Lynch movie. So there's those kind of like really pleasant aspects just to the reading experience. And then the characters are all really well drawn. The plotting is pretty strong, and it does sort of carry you through. So there's just so many different aspects that I see it as a really strong overall text. And then you add those cultural aspects that I think would be really appealing to a jury.
You mentioned earlier you had a passage.
I do have a passage. Do you want me to read it?
Yeah.
Okay. So this one is focusing on Martin, who I had talked about earlier. He meets Réjean through the Chevy dealership. And so Réjean buys a new Chevy every year, which to me is sort of astounding and impossible, but that's beside the point. And so
most unrealistic part of the whole book.
Yeah. So Martin is a salesman for Chevy, but he secretly owns a Ford. And Martin is a really interesting figure in the book because so much of the book deals with like masculinity and different forms of masculinity. And Martin, he is such an outsider in so many ways. And he almost looks to Réjean in terms of like, he doesn't understand how to behave in the way that other men behave. And he thinks that Réjean is like this perfect example of how he should behave. Martin doesn't understand masculine friendships either. So he looks to his father and the types of friendships that his father would have had. And he tries to replicate those friendships with Réjean. So this is a part of the text where Martin is thinking about his father and thinking about Ford trucks. So Martin's last name is Bureau, and his father's first name is Jack. Jack Bureau used only Ford trucks on the job. They were a strong, imposing vehicle with a reputation for reliability in any climate and superior towing capacity. Just as Martin had learned from his dad that it was a man's responsibility to provide for his family and stand by his friends, he learned that the Ford embodied all that was right and true. Losing his father cemented Martin's allegiance to the Ford brand. He vowed that in his honor, he would never drive anything but a Ford. The circumstances of his hiring by the Chevy dealership were something he couldn't help. He hoped that if his father were still around, he would forgive his working for a competitor. Martin's enjoyment of an afternoon off-roading in the Ranger was a tribute to his father, and it had brought him nothing but joy until the day he met Réjean. As their friendship matured and their bond through the Chevy brand was galvanized, Martin's secret grew more and more burdensome. So that's the passage about Martin and his conflicted relationship with Fords and Chevys. And a little detail, this is one of those details I'm talking about makes the book so funny. Winters has Martin get to the Chevy dealership in a bus. So he only takes the bus to get to the Chevy dealership because he doesn't want anybody to know that he drives a Ford Ranger.
I love it.
There is a lot in there, like that one passage, you know, between like the idea of reliability and strength and allegiance and this whole relationship with the father too. Like that was a pretty heavy passage. But is the whole book kind of dense like that, or is there a lot of dialogue? Like, what's the pacing like?
No, it's a pretty dense in that way. Yeah, there is dialogue, and I feel like there is that sort of thrillerish movement that helps the plot move along. I don't find it too difficult to read. I found it pretty enjoyable.
How long is the book?
I don't know. I don't have a page number. I listened to it.
And for reference, Tom listens to audiobooks on like double speed, which is just not human. I don't understand it. It's
I
so
would find
bad.
that. I feel like I'd find that distracting.
Or that someone's angry at me and they can't get all their thoughts out at once. Like I can't handle it at all. But I mean, that's he consumes a lot of like.
Well,
literature,
I could understand like to be more productive and to get through books.
Yeah, like yesterday I was driving. I had to drive Violet to a ski race, so I couldn't reread the book while I was driving.
And recently, just as a small aside, Tom was also listening to.
I can. Yeah. So I was listening to The Mystery of Edwin Drood by Charles Dickens.
Oh.
And with Douglas in the car, and I was driving Douglas somewhere, and
he's 8 years old.
And he's a very clever 8-year-old. And so in the Dickens book, there's a character whose name is Edwin, and Edwin is betrothed to a character who he has nicknamed, completely innocent at the time, Pussy. And so he's talking to someone about how much he loves his pussy. And he's like, oh, my little pussy, how wonderful Pussy is. And I'm going to go see my pussy, and my pussy will be so delighted to see me. And so I'm just listening to this, and I'm thinking Douglas doesn't know what that word means or is. But I was just sort of inwardly just
I would have been
right?
losing it. Did Douglas say anything?
So I like afterwards I was explaining to Melissa what had happened, and I was like, there was a word in that was bad, but at the time it wouldn't have been bad. And he goes, yeah, I think I know what the word was.
Well, good for him for like kind of keeping it close to his vest.
For now, it probably at school.
At school.
Well, we were like, it's not like it would come out like that in school, that he would be like, but my father was listening to a Dickensian work on an audiobook. And be like, my dad had on a podcast all about pussy. We'd be getting calls from the school. So,
oh man, going back, I am really fascinated by this. And it is such a clear connection between like masculinity and trucks. Like, we all see it in our own world. And I live in a like relatively, I would say like rural area. And so like a lot of people have trucks, like men have trucks. Like my husband has a truck. He has a Ford truck. But my dad has a truck and he hates Fords. And like, so, and there's like, you have this connection to this vehicle, and it does make a statement about like who you are. Like my dad's truck is like literally like 400, almost 500,000 miles on this Toyota Tundra that he's been driving. And it's like a rust bucket, but like the engine is like go, go, go. My dad's like 73 and still working. And it's like such a symbol of like who he is as a person, like kind of falling apart, but still like really strong and going. You know, it's funny though that like Rajan is like a tall, kind of powerful, because he only, there's always that joke about like small men with big trucks and how it's like essentially like a euphemism for like, trying to prove your masculinity,
Yeah, how does it do that in the book? Because you said that earlier too, like about it being an extension of a person. How does she illustrate that?
I mean, in a couple of different ways. I think if I could just add one thing though, too, I think that it's a really, at least the way it's represented in the novel, it's a tricky thing because I think that she's respectful towards the idea that our connections to vehicles and objects is actually really meaningful. Like, I don't think she's just saying that it's just a superficial thing. I think it really does inform our identities for better or for worse. It, gets into really deep details like, honoring your father's legacy, right? And even in just the passage that I read there, it's tricky because I think as someone who tends to just make fun of everything, making fun of the truck as a symbol for a guy with a small
stature.
This isn't a Dickens novel. We're not going to swear all the time. Come on. That's where my mind goes, making fun of these connections. But there is that sincerity to these objects that are, so profound. I don't think necessarily Rajan would say this is a profound connection I have to my truck, but it is the way that character is represented, and for Martin it is as well. And it's interesting too in terms of masculine identity. Once Rajan goes missing, Agathe eventually learns how to drive the truck, and she finds out just how empowering it is for her to be able to do that on her own, and how that can inform her identity too. The objects in our lives have so much meaning, and we sometimes don't even stop and think about how meaningful they are and how much they inform our identity. In a way, just how interconnected we are with so many different objects or machines or whatever, right?
But you said you found the book because you were going to use it for research, and then you were looking for things related to objects. But it does, no offense, seem really obscure. Like, I need a book set in New Brunswick relating to objects and relationships with objects, and like, boom, here this book was. But maybe I'm wrong. Like, is this actually like a really big area of research that people are talking about a lot?
Yeah, so there is a critical text called Vibrant Matter. It's actually a text published in the States. It's a popular sort of theoretical movement. Thinking about objects in general is pretty trendy right now.
I would imagine that as we become more intertwined with technology, I mean, you think about our relationships that we have with our phones, right? And this idea of kind of us all kind of eventually becoming cyborgs in a way. We already are. There's an identity that I feel lost without my phone. If it's not like on my person, I'm like, feel a little desperate. And I could see that there being more research and written works exploring that kind of relationship, because we are, more now than ever, I think there are certain things that we can't function without.
Yeah, when you said it was going to be about like a sort of an extension of our identity, my first thought was, if I had to pick an object that is an extension of my identity, it totally wouldn't be our vehicle. Like, it would,
your phone?
It would 100% be my phone. And I think most people would feel that way. So I was a little bit surprised that, when is the book set?
Published in 2016. But actually, it feels like it would have been set much further back than that.
But like in the 60s or like?
I'm totally guessing, but like it feels like early 90s, mid 90s.
Okay.
Agathe is a cigarette smoker. Well, there's no cell phones or anything like that. Okay. So
and
it just feels like a New Brunswick that probably doesn't exist quite in the same way. I might say it in the text somewhere what the actual year it is. It probably does.
But it sounds like it predates the smartphone era. So that makes sense, actually, that people would probably see more of their identity in their vehicle.
It goes deeper than this in terms of a boring answer, because the real way that I found out about Vibrant Matter is because I was reading an essay that was an essay on teaching methods and the use of cell phones in the classroom. And this was an essay published in Kairos, which is like a multimodal journal. And the essay is called, "Do Your Cell Phones Make You Smarter?" And he talks about how cell phones are active objects that change us the minute we start to use them. He uses just some obvious examples like maps, I mean, the way we read maps is totally different now.
Mm.
The way we spell, totally different. Just our interactions with language in general, just completely different due to cell phones. So they are actively changing us. And Vibrant Matter is just one of the books in the works I did there. So I found, I did that research, and then Vibrant Matter, and then I was like, I need a book about New Brunswick, and I found a book about trucks. Boring.
No, Tom, you've had like such a long relationship with literature set in New Brunswick. So it makes me happy to know that you found this. You've done so. I mean, even back in our masters, you really honed in on when we did like our Canadian fiction course. Like that was a big part of your kind of fascination, was like looking at, kind of local to you because you're from New Brunswick, literature and authors. And I don't know, the fact that you were kind of blindly looking for something and then this book kind of like just fell into your hands. That's awesome.
It's pretty cool to find it, I must say.
So what do you think, Tom Halford? Would you say that I Am a Truck by Michelle Winters is a could read, a should read, or a must read?
From my point of view, it's a must read.
Ooh,
yeah.
Nice.
I mean, this is especially if, I mean, it's from my own perspective, right? As someone who really loves Atlantic Canadian literature and is reading it whenever I can find any. It's a weird, quirky book that reflects a part of the country that doesn't always get shown. And for that reason, I think combined with just the overall quality of the writing in the text, it's a must read for me. I mean, I can completely appreciate how obscure the book is and how small a part of the world New Brunswick is. I appreciate all of those things. But for me, it is just one of those perfect like finds, like a cult read almost. And it's a real treat to read too. Like I feel like the characters are all really sharply drawn, and the whole book is constructed in such a way that it is a really just like a well-composed piece. So aesthetically, it's a must read, but also for me, just thematically and just based on my own personal interests, it's a must read too.
Fantastic.
Yeah, I'm excited. I'm gonna read this.
Yeah, this definitely was not anywhere on my TBR radar. I don't know what TDR stands for, but I'm sure if I Google it, I'll find lots of interesting things.
Probably also in that Dickens novel.
Yeah. But now it is. It's definitely on that radar. So, wow, it's great to get the gang back together again, isn't it?
No, warms my heart. Always does.
Absolutely. Yeah, this has been super fun. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Can I plug my book?
Yeah,
yes, please.
So the last book I published is called The Abstracts, and it's published through Pay-Per-View Independent Press, and you can find it just by typing Tom Halford The Abstracts into Google. And The Abstracts does, I don't know, I feel like it does deal with objects quite a bit, and how objects can sort of come to life. And the twist here is that the objects in this book are all garbage, and they speak directly to us as readers.
It's a great book.
Excellent.
Lots of fun to read.
And I got a copy when I was visiting you guys this summer. Yeah.
Did he sign it? I always give him a hard time that he doesn't sign the books.
I don't
sign them.
I don't think you did.
I'm embarrassed about signing it because it feels smug. I don't know what it is. Like, thanks for reading. I don't know. Why would I give an autograph to anyone? Like, who am I to give autographs? Do you know what I mean? It just feels very bizarre.
I don't know. I don't think mine's signed, but the fact that you physically gave it to me is exciting. So, and you have another book that was your first book that was published was Deli Meat.
Right?
That was your first book that was published.
Crime novel.
Yeah. You love a crime.
Yeah, I do. I mean, if I'm going to sit down and read a book, it's probably going to be a crime thriller. So that's again why I like this one so much. And then the last book, I also have a book published called Millrat, which is set in New Brunswick and is also the weird aspects of New Brunswick that don't always get talked about. But you can't buy it.
Yeah, that wasn't a plug at all. But that one also deals with a lot of toxic masculinity issues and stuff too, which I thought was interesting. That also comes up as if issues of toxic masculinity are really severe in New Brunswick or something. But as always, a pleasure to see you, Sarah. A pleasure to chat with you both.
Bye.
I guess they can't hear me waving.